It's the final day of the four-day G20 meeting in Johannesburg, the first such meeting on African soil. Central bank governors and finance ministers met to look at a number of challenges confronting the world today. Our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, joins us now to describe how the first meeting of South Africa's G20 presidency shaped up. Xolani, a very good afternoon to you. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump has already started shaking geopolitics, threatening BRICS with tariffs, and other countries like Canada are G20 delegates talking about how Trump could rattle South Africa's G20 presidency with his own demands.
Good afternoon, Vuyo. Although delegates are not outright about whether they are actually discussing the incoming president of the USA, Donald Trump, we all know that institutions such as the United Nations, BRICS, the G20 bloc of countries, the World Economic Forum are just not sure what is going to come back into the White House demanding of the rest of the world. And it's something that is quite serious, that even when he has not taken office, he has made threats to the likes of the BRICS nations over the issue that Kotongwana, the finance minister, says is a non-issue of de-dollarization. But we asked the Reserve Bank Governor earlier, because there is a troika of countries which is quite important for the G20 throughout these meetings. It is Brazil, South Africa, and the incoming country which is going to take over the presidency next year, which is the USA. We asked what he thinks about the USA and Trump coming into the fold with his own administration, whether he could actually tinker with how the G20 is being run by South Africa as it holds the presidency. So all these organizations are just waiting to see what Trump is going to come with when he is inaugurated in the third week of January. This is what Lesotho said earlier about what is important to note regarding the presidency of the G20 and why he thinks that the USA might not be a factor at all.
Priorities gets highlighted. It is for the presidency to decide what the priorities are. The only time when priorities changed was when we had a shock, like when we had the COVID shock. The G20 refocused and started focus on the impact of COVID on the economy. We expected, this was the year of the great election year, as it was called. There have been changes in political leadership across the world, and that is takes place all the time. But it doesn't have bearing on the priorities, because the priorities are set by the presidency, and in this case is the South African president.
The real work, of course, Xolani, gets done at the level of governors, at the level of ministers, and the like, and less so at the level of heads of state, which is what just happened in Rio only last month, and what will happen here in South Africa in November or thereabout. What did our Reserve Bank governor have to say about the series of meetings that they are going to have and the impact that they are going to have on the agenda of the G20 over the next year?
Well, he was very clear that this is the most important series of meetings. The finance track, which involves finance ministers and central bank governors, is what actually the G20 is all about. Even in his opening address earlier this morning, he was quite clear to say that South Africa should streamline its work and focus on the finance issues and make sure that you actually eliminate all of the things that are distractions that have become part of the G20. If you streamline, choose your battles, you will win those battles. And he was talking about a number of issues, including the fact that they will be taking stock of how central bank governors have actually performed in protecting consumers around the world from a high inflationary environment that we've seen over the past 2 years, and whether the responses of the central banks have been adequate with using that tool of interest rates as a means of cooling runaway inflation. This is how he responded to how much of the important work affects ordinary people around the world.
So you have had a surge in inflation in 2022. There are many central banks in the advanced economies that tried to convince themselves that inflation was not persistent, that it was transitory, and but they soon realized that the inflation monster is here with us. And central banks eventually responded to that. And we are now talking about the disinflation process. And across the globe, inflation is coming down. And so you could say that central banks have been successful in bringing down inflation. And how do we see this? We see that globally, central banks have also now started to reduce the level of the restrictiveness of monetary policy because they are confident that inflation is actually coming down.
From his vantage point, I reckon Xolani Mbanjwa would say or think that this has to be probably the most important meeting of the entire series of meetings that are going to be held over the next year.
Oh, yes, this is something that we also asked him about earlier, as far as outside of the issue of climate finance, the artificial intelligence, also the slow economic growth globally, unemployment, a high inflationary environment. What are the issues that are important to him? And he touched on something that we have looked at Newzroom Afrika as far as African debt crisis is concerned, wherein many countries in Africa are actually unable to service their debt. When you look at 2012, debt was sitting at $485 billion US. Today, it sits at $1.8 trillion US. It takes away from the developmental and infrastructure needs that are needed from poorer countries on the continent. When we asked him what is the other issue that actually he wants to highlight at this meeting, this is what he had to say.
But one of the things that the minister talked about yesterday was the extent of the debt situation, and talking about other countries almost facing a solvency problem as a result of the debt challenges that they are facing. And a lot of focus tended to focus on the level of the debt relative to GDP, and increasingly what there is a concern about now has to do with the debt servicing costs and the impact that debt servicing costs have on the finances of various countries, including here, where debt servicing costs have risen, and we are now spending more on debt servicing costs than we spend on education or we are spending on health. Globally, the OECD released a report on the extent of the global debt problem, and the OECD has highlighted that this could actually pose a global a risk to global financial stability. So that had become an important issue, and for us on the African continent, many of the countries that had to renegotiate their debts.
Vuyo, when it comes to the next hour, we will hear from Enoch Kotongwana, the finance minister, closing of this 4-day series of meetings that are so important to find out what has been achieved and what is the next step as we head to February at the next meeting, a higher level meeting of high-profile individuals and ministers that is going to be held in Cape Town for the G20. But he's going to tell us at 4 o'clock what has been achieved over the past 4 days. Back to you in studio, Vuyo.
Of course, Xolani, I wouldn't have expected any different answer from a central bank governor to the one that Lesetja Kganyago gave to your question. Certainly, I mean, coming from a Reserve Bank governor, it has to be about the issues that he raised. But of course, bearing in mind also that global financial stability, which he mentions there, is the reason we have a G20 today. Because back in the day when it was formed, it was because of threats to global financial stability. Xolani, of course, will be bringing more on the outcomes of that 4-day G20 meeting, when a little later on, he and others will be speaking to our Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, and we'll bring you that briefing live here on the program. More on the day's leading stories in a moment. Do stay tuned.